No God like Jehovah. It is a happy Sabbath, church. It is a privilege to be here with you all. A lot of what was just said is still fresh on my mind, hungry, humble, and smart. My parents may have a different testimony, but the Lord has inspired this conference to see potential in me. And I would simply say that I live my life by this simple motto: to know him and to make him known. And that is the entire sum of my ministry. But in saying that, I am probably still the least deserving man to stand at this pulpit. And yet God has allowed me to be stationed here with you all. And for that, I give him thanks. I would like to also extend words of appreciation to the Allegheny West administrative team, to you, Vice President Johnson, and to President Brown, and to Dr. Joseph for hiring me and allowing me to be here with you all. I also extend appreciation to my fellow pastoral team, to Chaplain Bodie for, I know he's going to be working with me, and for Dr. Trustee, who willingly took a fresh graduate under his wing. And for that, I give my appreciations. I would also like to appreciate my family, my brothers, the two that are here and the one that's still back at home, and for my parents, who each together and in their own way raised me to know Christ as my personal Savior. I must confess that I am a man of unclean lips. And so whatever message comes from me today will not be mine, but the Spirit's, and that is my prayer for you all. I find it rather providential that this Sabbath was Graduates' Appreciation Sabbath, because our passage for reflection today is somewhat a graduate story. It is a change of identity from what someone was before to what they are called to be. Our passage is coming from a very familiar story, and so our scripture setting is Genesis chapter 32, starting at verses 22, and we will read to 32. I understand that it is the custom of this church to engage in participatory reading. And so I encourage you all to stand with me as we read to starting at verse 22. The same night he got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 maids, and his 11 children, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream, and likewise everything that he had. Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. Then he said, "Let me go, for the day is breaking." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go until you bless me." So he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." Then the man said, "You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel. For you have striven with God and with humanity, and you have prevailed." Then Jacob asked him, "Please tell me your name." But he said, "Why is it that you ask my name?" And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "For I have seen God face to face, and yet my life is spared." Therefore, to this day, the Israelites do not eat the thigh muscle that is on the hip socket, because he struck Jacob on the hip socket at the thigh muscle. I will be speaking to you under the subject, alone, confused, and fighting. Alone, confused, and fighting for a blessing. Let us pray. Dear Lord, I thank you for this day and for allowing me to be here with your people. But Lord, I must be honest that this message may come across better and be more impressive in the hands of a mightier speaker. I am simply a sinner standing before your people to share a word from the Lord. And so I pray, Lord, that I may share a message that even I myself need to hear. And so I pray, Lord, that your Spirit would be with us now, and that you would be guiding my words and thoughts, that I may speak to your people. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. This is undeniably one of the most confusing passages in all of Scripture. For centuries, Christians, Jews, and Muslims have debated what on earth was going on that night. And it's undeniable that this story is the central story in the life of Jacob. That despite all the other interesting anecdotes, the fact that he deceived his father, the fact that he ended up marrying 4 women, the fact that he ends up going to Egypt older than the Pharaoh himself, the most important story in the life of Jacob is this one night, this chapter. But in order to understand what is going on in the life of Jacob, you must understand that this is a man on the run. That this is a man who has been running away from home and from his own family for nearly 20 years. I am not a runner, but Mauro Prosperi is. And you don't know who that is, but in 1994, this man decided to travel to Morocco to participate in the Marathon of the Sands, a 156-mile-long race spanning 6 days across the Sahara Desert in North Africa. Prosperi was running, and on the 4th day, he found himself at the front of the pack, and he was in 4th position. He was alone in front of everybody else. And suddenly, a mighty wind started blowing over those sand dunes, and it rose into a sandstorm. And Prosperi knew that the protocol was to wait in place until the storm passed. But Prosperi felt that he might lose his lead if he were to stay in place. So he decided that he would keep running alone through the storm. So he just kept trekking on, and 8 hours later, the sandstorm died, and Prosperi looked out over the horizon only to realize he could not see the race course anywhere in sight. This man was alone, lost in the largest desert on earth. The temperature was 115 degrees, and he had no resources. And so lost, Prosperi decided to wait there finally. And that evening, as the sun set, he saw a helicopter approaching. He took his flare and shot directly at the chopper, only for it to carry on flying away. And so Prosperi, with nothing else to do, just decided to walk back in the direction he thought camp was. And so Prosperi, on the 3rd day, saw an airplane coming and desperately burned his backpack to create a smoke flare, hoping the plane would see him. And it kept flying on by. Prosperi was so dejected that by the 4th day, he decided to end his life. He laid down, took a small pocket knife in his pant pocket, cut his wrists so that he might die. Only to wake up on the 5th day to realize that he was so dehydrated that he was unable to bleed out. And so, finding a renewed sense of vigor, a renewed sense of hope, of motivation, he decided he was just going to keep walking till he could walk no more. He saw mountains in the distance and kept traveling. And eventually, on the 9th day of being lost in the desert, he found the greatest sight a man could see. fresh goat droppings. And he followed them until he came across a little shepherd girl. And he followed her back to her campsite, and eventually he got placed in a hospital. And then he finally realized how off course he actually was. He had run 180 miles in the opposite direction from the race course. That's the equivalent of running from here to Cleveland through 115-degree heat with no water. All because this man decided that he was going to run alone to stay ahead of the rest. He lost 33 pounds and took nearly 2 years to recover. Now, our story is about a man named Jacob, and he didn't run for 9 days like Prosperi. He ran for 20 years. And that is what we are reflecting on today, the story of a man named Jacob. To understand the story of Jacob, you have to understand that he was a special child. Since he was born, he was reminded that he was a unique boy, that he was going to be successful. You see, his mother had received a word from the Lord that 2 nations are in your womb. One is stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. And so she raised Jacob to know that this man, this boy, was a special boy, that he was going to be successful, that he would be great, that he would be in charge. And it is ironic that her scheming eventually cost him everything. Sometimes parents doing what they think is best for their children end up ruining their lives. But that's a different sermon. Rebekah decided to trick her own husband, to trick Isaac and deceive him into bestowing the blessing that was reserved for her other son Esau on to Jacob. And Jacob willingly followed through with this plan. You can read the story in Genesis 27. Jacob deceives his own father, betrays his own brother, just to get that blessing. Too often, families fall apart when one member decides to put themselves first and do whatever it takes to get ahead. Esau truly said it when he said, "This man lives up to his name," the supplanter, the go-getter, the one who gets ahead. There are too many supplanters today. We live in a world of me first. Now, you may not be familiar with the story of Jacob. Perhaps you've never read it before, but I'm sure that you all at least know someone named Jacob. And if you don't, you at least know someone who acts like Jacob. So whether we like it or not, we are all at least a little familiar with the story of a man named Jacob. You see, Jacob is that type of individual who is selfish, self-serving, self-satisfying. He is the type of man that is pursuit of happiness at every expense type of man. Jacob just wanted to get ahead because that's what his God-fearing mother raised him to believe, that that was his future, that that was his purpose, that he was meant to be in charge of the family. There are too many people like that today, especially in our Western society. The society is so individualistic, self-seeking, self-serving. Let me look for my own interests first. And you know what's even more frightening is many of them are sitting in church pews. But not my church, no, of course not. You see, Jacob was only doing what his mother had raised him to believe. This was God's will. God wanted Jacob to be first. God wanted Jacob to be blessed. Jacob was only doing what he felt was the will of God. How many times do people do what they feel like doing, what they want to do, and then say it's the will of God? How many times are people chasing after their own dreams, their own ambitions, and then when they get it, they say, God willed it all the while? But how many of you know that just because something happens does not mean that's what God wanted to happen? You see, we say that about the negative things when tragedies hit our lives, but how many of us are willing to admit that sometimes even the good things, or the things we think are good things, weren't meant for our lives? Just because you got what you wanted does not mean you got what God wanted for you. And so Jacob is living in pursuit of what he thinks is the will of God, just to get that blessing. And in the end, it cost him everything. By trying to get a blessing, Jacob brought a curse upon himself. Jacob was only doing what he thought he was entitled to, and yet it all backfired. You can read the story for yourself. Jacob lost his family, betrayed his brother, and lost everything. The blessing, the birthright, it all never went to him. Jacob in chapter 32 prays to God, I left with nothing but this staff in my hand, and everything I'm bringing back you gave to me, Lord. Nothing that God had given to Abraham ended up in the hands of Jacob. By trying to steal the blessing of his brother, Jacob lost everything. Jacob failed so miserably that the land God told Abraham to get out of was the only place Jacob had left to go to. God said to Abraham, for your own sake, get out of the house of your family and go to the land that I will show you. And just 2 generations later, Jacob fails so miserably, he has to go back. Sometimes in life, there are parents and grandparents who faithfully followed the will of the Lord, and yet their children or grandchildren are not walking in the way that he brought them. And it seems desperate, it seems bleak, and sometimes you wonder, Lord, why? But I tell you, there's still hope for the story of Jacob. See, he is going to the land of Haran because he's running away from his family. He's running away from his brother, but it doesn't get any better in the land of Aram. The same drama that circled Jacob's life in Canaan follows him to the house of Laban. He's deceived into a marriage. His own cousins trick him out of wages. He's locked into servitude for 14 years. And so the same drama that was just repeating itself in Canaan repeats itself here on the other end. And eventually, Jacob is so fed up, he decides to run away again. You see, Jacob is a man on the run. He ran away from one family only to go as far as he could to turn around and have to run back. Jacob is out of luck. You read that story, that famous passage we love to quote, may the Lord watch between me and thee. And you understand what Jacob and Laban are actually saying to each other. If I ever see you again, I will slaughter you like this goat. Jacob and Laban are swearing before the Lord their God that they hope to never see each other again. Jacob is a man who, because of his own ambitions, has brought his family to ruin. There's an old saying, I'm caught between a rock and a hard place. And in Jacob's life, those 2 difficult places to be were both family. That's a frightening thought to think. And so now Jacob finds himself in the desert on the way back. And on the way back, he hears that his brother has caught wind of his return. And rather than sending in the welcoming mat, Esau is coming with an army, 400 armed men. And Jacob is so confused. God, you told me to return. Now where on earth am I going? And so he finds himself there, and he prays and prepares. And the best solution that he can come up with is to try and bribe his brother. He sends gifts, one after the other, increasing in value, hoping that he'll appease Esau. His other solution is that he divides his family into 2 camps, hoping that at least one of them might survive. Imagine how desperate Jacob is, that his best hope is that at least half of my family might survive. Jacob has been on the run for 20 years. He has ruined his family in Canaan. He has come to the worst situation in Haran, and now his best hope is that maybe I can at least keep half of my family. And so Jacob is sitting there. He crosses his children over to the other side, and there he is alone. All he can hear is the sound of the river underneath him in the ford. There's the stars in the sky. He can hear his children crying on the other side, and there he is alone in the night, wondering what is he going to do. He is alone both literally and relationally. And I just want to pause here and to speak about this fact that Jacob was alone for two reasons. One, he sent his family away so that he might face Esau alone. But he was also alone because of his past character. Jacob's actions of selfishness, of self-serving, of self-satisfying have made him have no one that he could turn to. He can't go back to Laban. He just swore never to see him again. He can't go further because his own brother is coming to murder him, and he has no one to turn to. Loneliness is on the rise. How many of you know that along with the COVID pandemic, there has been a pandemic of loneliness in America? These social distancings and lockdowns, which were necessary for our physical health, only contributed to an increasing trend of loneliness in America. At least a third of all Americans admit to feeling severely lonely, and that number jumps up to nearly 2/3 for young adults. People are alone. And it seems shocking to me that in a world of social media, of every possible technology and resource for connection, we are still feeling desperately alone. We have no one to turn to, and we feel like we are on our own. Researchers came to a very obvious conclusion to me, but they realized that physical isolation is not what contributes to loneliness. You may know as little as 3 people and feel less lonely than the person who knows 3,000. You want to know why? You want to know what they discovered? It's not the quantity of your relationships, but the quality of the relationships that you do have. Some of the most popular people are the loneliest to ever walk the earth. All these TikTok stars, to be honest with you, I'm not on social media, but when I see a 16-year-old living in a mansion because of their online social media platform, I can't deny that I wonder, maybe I should do that too. But it has been studied that these people living in the social media sphere are lonely because they have no community. How many people do you know have just been leaving the church not understanding that it is one of the most fundamental communities of society? That other than family, this is your primary community. And yet so many people are deserting it left and right for no reason whatsoever. They're just dropping friends like flies. And now, I'm not denying that sometimes there are legitimate reasons to cut someone out of your life. There are some serious situations that the best choice is to put up a strong barrier and go the other way. But let's be honest, how many times do we actually find ourselves in that type of situation? How much more often is it that people come to church and sit on opposite sides of the sanctuary simply because that person looks sad, or that person disrespected me, or that person didn't speak to me in the right tone? How many people are cutting others out of their lives simply out of the pursuit of happiness? I have friends that have cut off their entire families just because their parents disagreed with their lifestyle. Not realizing that they are losing the most important thing they have on this earth, because it doesn't matter how much riches you have. It doesn't matter how popular you become. It does not matter how well known you are, because at the end of the day, when you lose it all you'll have left is family. And yet Jacob, in pursuit of the wealth, in pursuit of the double blessing birthright, in pursuit of that which he thought was his, he cost himself his own family. Now you may be wondering, why would Esau be so angry as to swear to murder his brother over a blessing? A few words spoken by their father. But you have to understand that in their culture, a blessing is more than mere words. A blessing is an act of divine providence. A blessing is a way of engaging God into somebody's life. In effect, Jacob was compromising his brother's potential relationship with God just so that he could get ahead. And there is no worse offense than that. That Jacob was willing to deny God's involvement in his own brother's life just so that he could make himself richer. And it cost him everything. And he had nothing left. And so Jacob is there with the realization that his life has fallen apart because of his own actions. He is both the victim and the villain of his own story. Jacob, at every turn, has only made things worse. And so now Jacob is alone, and in this moment, it's hot right now, but you can imagine how much hotter it is in the desert. He is sweating buckets. He knows that come the morning, he is facing his destiny and he might die. And so Jacob, being alone, has nothing else that he can do. And so he's just praying. And all of a sudden, when he's already at his lowest, when he has gone so far he can go no further, when he is literally has nothing else to turn to, somebody shows up for a fight. While this man is down on his knees begging to God for a way of deliverance, somebody grabs him from behind and picks a fight. I'm not going to deny to you that to this day, as much as I studied, I prepared for 2 months for this sermon, and I still do not understand why God came seeking for a fight. This man literally has nothing left. This man might die tomorrow, and God's way of comforting him is to pick a fight. Why on earth is God picking a fight with Jacob? And they wrestle all night long. This man, you should read the chronology. Jacob is close to 100 years old at this point. Jacob does not got it in him, but he is giving it his all. He has no idea who this man might be, and yet it says that capital H, him, could not prevail against little h, him. That this man could not overcome the patriarch Jacob. That they wrestled all night long, and as the day was breaking, the man realized he could not prevail against him. And so he plays dirty. He breaks his hip. Now, I'm still a young man. I have no idea what it's like to live with a broken hip. But I've been told that at a certain age, life does it for you. And it makes me wonder how on earth Jacob kept holding on. The man said, "Let me go, for the day is breaking." And Jacob responds with the most profound words ever spoken in human history. "I will not let you go until you bless me." I was affirmed of this message when I saw 2 weeks ago Chaplain Bodie reference this very passage. We've been studying Genesis for the last few months. And in this moment, Jacob is confessing, as all of us should, that he will not let go until you bless me. I don't care that you broke my hip. I don't care that we've been struggling all night long. I'm not letting go until you bless me. But there's something even more profound going on here. The man said, let me go, for the day is breaking. After the story concludes, Jacob calls that place Peniel, saying, I have seen the Lord face to face and yet survived. So understand what was going on in that moment. The man says, let me go, for the day is breaking. Why? Because when the light comes, it will reveal his face. You see, through the night, Jacob did not know who he was fighting. But come the daybreak, he understood that he was fighting God. And the man says, let me go for your sake, Jacob, because come the daybreak, if you see my face, you'll die. And yet, knowing full well that he might die, Jacob says, I will not let you go until you bless me. I would rather die than carry on without a blessing. Jacob understands the magnitude of what he is asking. He understands that he is risking it all, and yet he cries out, I will not let go until you bless me. Jacob is in a mess of his own making. Many of us are also in the same. And yet Jacob, knowing he has no right to demand such a thing, knowing that what is coming for him, he deserves, knowing the guilt of the last 20 years, yet he still has the audacity to ask for a blessing. Yet knowing that he is in his own problem and rightly deserves whatever punishment is coming, he says, I am not letting go until I get a blessing. But there's something even more interesting. The man says, all right, I'll bless you, but I got one question. What is your name? And Jacob, holding on to him, says, my name is Jacob. But you have to understand how profound this is, because the last time Jacob was asked that question for a blessing, who are you and what is your name? He lied and said, my name's Esau. And see, he brought a curse on himself that day that followed him for the next 20 years. And yet here in this desperation, when asked, who are you? He says, my name is Jacob. I am that man. I am the supplanter, the heel grabber. I am the trickster who got tricked. I am the brother betrayer. I am Jacob. He admits to who he is because he understands that's the only way he'll get a blessing. How often are we trying to get blessings pretending to be somebody else, pretending to be something that we are not, coming up in church and acting all holy as if that's how we're going to get blessed? But how many of us are willing to admit that only when we are honest with ourselves for who we are, then we can get a blessing? Only when he says, my name is Jacob, and confesses that is who I am, that the man says, the most beautiful blessing I have ever heard. You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel. And with that one word, the man not just blessed Jacob, but every descendant after him. You shall be called Israel because you struggled with God and yet prevailed. And you see, his descendants weren't called the Jacobites. They were called the Israelites because these are the people willing to struggle with God until they prevail. And how many of us are willing to also claim the title of spiritual Israel that Paul himself places on us? Those who are willing to struggle with God until we get a blessing. God's blessing to Jacob was to give him a new identity, but not an easy one. God's blessing to Jacob is not an easy blessing. You will be called the one who struggles, because you have struggled with both God and humanity and yet prevailed. Your name will be Israel. And this odd turn of events, Jacob feels like saying, please tell me your name. And the man says, why on earth do you need my name? And he blessed him there. And he blessed him and left. But you see, something else strange is going on. You see, he gave him a new name, but his hip was still broken. He gave him a new name, but he was still in a whole lot of pain. God gave Jacob the blessing of struggling till he prevails, and yet left him disabled, left him crippled, left him with something that would hinder his potential to carry on the struggle. And the question I ask myself is why? Because you see, Jacob was a man on the run. For 20 years, he has been on the run. And yet God's blessing to Jacob is to make sure he can never run again. God's blessing to Jacob is to take away his default method of survival, to take away his way of handling every situation, to take away his human method of overcoming obstacles in his way. His method was to run away, and God said, oh no, not anymore. You ain't ever gonna run again. You're gonna struggle, but guess what? You have nowhere to go. And God, his blessing to Jacob is to leave him broken, to leave him in pain. And yet Jacob is the man who says, I will hold on for a blessing. And church, how many of us are of the same way, that we will hold on to a blessing? That we may have been saving our pennies for years, but yet we're still not debt-free, but we will hold on for a blessing. The fact that we've been praying for our children and grandchildren for years and years and years, and it seems like nothing is coming their way, yet I will hold on for a blessing. Maybe you feel like you're struggling at school. Maybe you feel like you're struggling at work, and yet you will hold on for a blessing. I may have lost it all. I might be in a mess of my own making, but God, I will hold on until I get my blessing. I did not come this far just to come this far. I'm going further. I'm going to cross the Jordan. I'll get to the other side. How many of us have the same commitment as Jacob, that even in the face of death, he's willing to say, I will not let go until you bless me? But church, can I be honest with you? So far, I've just been giving you some good advice. But can I now give you some good news? You see, the question that is on my mind, the question that I have not yet addressed, is why on earth was that man there in the first place? And for that, I turn your attention to verse 24. I turn your attention to verse 24. And Jacob was alone and wrestled with a man until daybreak. You didn't catch it. You see, Jacob was alone, and yet he wrestled with a man until daybreak. I'm going to say that again. Jacob was alone, and yet he wrestled with a man until daybreak. You see, the book doesn't say a man showed up. It doesn't say a man appeared. It does not say a man arrived. You see, he was alone, and yet that man was already there. You see, that man was with Jacob even in his aloneness. That man was with Jacob when Jacob had nowhere else to turn to. But you see, there's more to that one verse. Because Jacob was alone, and yet he was with somebody. But you see, I still haven't addressed the biggest question. Why on earth did he pick a fight? Now, the word wrestle in this one passage, I love the languages. I love the languages. You see, the book was not written in English. The book was written in some ancient words. Can everybody say ancient words? You see, and these ancient words have a way of saying things that we could never even catch in the English. Because the word wrestled in this passage is a unique word, a special word. It's the word avak, like avocado. The word avak only occurs in this one passage, nowhere else in all of Scripture. It's not even the Hebrew word for fighting. It's not even the Hebrew word for wrestling. The word avok is composed of blending two words together. The Hebrew word for dust, spelled the same way. And then the word havak, the verb, the Hebrew word for hug. By combining these two words, God came down to hug Jacob in such a way that he got down in the dust with him. God came to Jacob to hug him and embrace him in such a way that he got down in the mess of his own making, that he got down in the mud and the dirt and the dust of the earth with him. The God who made man from the dust of the earth is now wrestling with a man in the dust of the earth. He came down to embrace Jacob in such a way that he would get down in the mess with him. The writer of this passage is not doing things flippantly. He's not doing things on a willy-nilly. This man knows what he is writing. He picked this word for a particular purpose. This man knows exactly what he's trying to say. You see, the God of all creation, with all might and power, the God who could blow away Jacob in an instant, who holds the world in his own hand, was willing to get down in the dirt with Jacob. He was willing to get involved in Jacob's mess. He struggled with Jacob. But there's more to this verse. Forgive me, I'm trying to use some of that Oakwood training. I'm trying to use some of that languages. The word wrestle is in the nifal stem. Now you may ask me, what's the nifal stem? The nifal stem is the Hebrew way of using the passive voice. Now, I know we all graduate high school and we left English back there, but the passive voice is where the subject of the verb is the recipient of the action. I'll say that again. The subject of the verb is the recipient of the action, not the initiator of the action. So when it says a man wrestled with Jacob, it's not the man who started the fight. The man ended up getting fought. The man came down to hug Jacob, and Jacob started swinging. How many of you are willing to believe in a God that despite the fact he's coming there to embrace you and you turn it into the fight for your life, he's willing to go all night long? How many of you know a God that despite the fact you have turned it into a fight, he is not leaving you there. He will stay with you as long as it takes. They went all night long. The God of all creation, Christ pre-incarnate, down there in the dust with one of his children, struggling with him because of a fight that he didn't ask for. He's there wrestling with Jacob. Because sometimes, and I'll be honest, all you can do is throw your fist in the air. And Jacob just started throwing his fist in the air, and he was surprised that someone caught it. But God was willing to come down and wrestle with Jacob. God was willing to get down in the muddy mess of Jacob's own making, down by the river where the flies and the mosquitoes are, down where all they can hear is the water rushing. They see the stars in the sky and children crying in the distance. And yet they're wrestling all night long. The spirit of prophecy says as much. It says a strong arm embraced Jacob, and Jacob thought that someone was trying to attack him. He didn't wait long enough to understand why an arm was embracing him in the first place. You see, God came down to support Jacob. God came down to be there with Jacob in his darkest hour, not just in spirit, but literally in the flesh. He came down as a man and wound up in a fight. And yet, the good news is that he was willing to fight. That knowing he had no obligation to Jacob, that he had no cause to stay with him there, knowing for a fact that he could kill him in a moment. He was playing a fair fight to the point that he realized he wasn't going to win. And so he decides to give Jacob the twofold blessing that he asked for. You see, Jacob wanted that double portion inheritance. Jacob wanted that blessing from his father. And God, sure enough, gave him a double portion blessing. You shall be called Israel, the one who's going to struggle. And guess what? I'll make your struggle harder. I'll leave you broken. Sometimes God has to break us in order to remake us. In order that you might be called Israel, he has to first break Jacob. In order that you might become something new, he must first take what he has made. You see, he made Jacob from that very dust of the earth. You see, he molded man in his image. And so if he wants to remake it, he can. And so Jacob learned a valuable lesson that day. The power was not in himself. That nothing he could do was going to solve the problem. And so in that moment, he cries out for a blessing. God, please, just bless me. I have nothing else. I have nowhere else to turn to. God, I just need a blessing. You see, I read it in such a way that it sounds like an act of defiance. But the fact is, the prophet Hosea, meditating on this passage, in Hosea chapter 12, verse 4, you can turn there. It gives us another perspective, a divine revelation of what Jacob was experiencing that night. Hosea 12, verse 4 says, he strove with the angel and prevailed, and yet he wept and begged for his favor. Jacob was asking for a blessing in humility. Jacob was asking for a blessing in sincerity. Jacob was admitting to the fact that what was coming for him tomorrow, he could not escape. There was nothing in his own power. Even though that he could wrestle with God himself, Jacob was willing to cry out and beg for his favor and say, I won't let go until you bless me. None of us have the right to demand of God. None of us have the right to tell God what to do for our lives. But how many of us are willing to cry out, to weep, and to say, Lord, bless me. Lord, I know I made it a struggle. Lord, I know I turned it into a fight. I know salvation isn't supposed to be a struggle. I know faith isn't supposed to be a fight. And Lord, I know I've made a mess. I know that I've ruined it. The spirit of prophecy says the greatest burden on Jacob's heart was knowing that his actions put the innocents at risk. Knowing because of his past, his children could potentially die. On Jacob's heart was an understanding that his actions had consequences. And he knew he had no right to demand of God. But he said, God, please, bless me. God, I won't let go until you bless me. And you see, there's something else in this text. This story was so important in the history of Israel that they never forgot it. The passage ends with a very obscure note in verse 32. Therefore, to this day, the Israelites do not eat the thigh muscle that is at the hip socket, because he was touched. Jacob was touched there at the hip socket. Understand what that means. More frequently than they kept the Passover feast, even more frequently than they kept the Sabbath, at every family meal, when they sat down together, they had to remember the night of wrestling. They had to remember when their ancestor begged of God, please bless me. At every time that the family came together in Israelite history, even to this day, when they sat down to eat, they had to remember we don't eat that part. because of what our ancestor went through. When Christ was sitting there at the Passover, guess what was also on his mind? He had to actively remember the night Jacob wrestled with him and said, I won't let go until you bless me. And how many of you are willing to say the same today? How many of you are willing to cry out, Lord, I won't let go until you bless me? God, I've ruined my life. God, I've made a mess that I can't solve. Can I be honest with you? I'm a young man, and I've made many mistakes. And by God's grace, my parents have been there to pull me through it. But even more than them, I know God was the one pulling me through it all the while. And now they're going to be leaving me here alone. And I'll be honest with you, for the last few weeks, I've been rather confused. But I'm not going to be fighting God any longer. I am willing to accept what God has in store for me.